So I guess first thing, just your initial thoughts. A new era of Suns basketball starting here with Frank Vogel leading the way.
Yeah, look, I like the hire. When you looked at the final candidates, the only I guess the only name to me that at least I personally felt that you could remove was Doc Rivers, and I say that with great respect and deference to Doc and what he has accomplished. I just feel like considering where the Suns want and need to go, and kind of considering Doc's most recent run, it was probably a good time to get a a voice and a guy who's maybe had a time to be out and reflect, observe maybe some of the changes that are going on in the league. And when you look at a Frank Vogel, that's a guy that fits the bill. I know Kevin Young was certainly strongly considered, and I think deservedly so. I've been a big supporter and proponent of Kevin Young. I think had they made the decision to go with KY, I don't think it would have been a bad decision. But I think probably at the end of the day, when you look at the construction of this roster and the window that we're working with, I'm guessing, and I don't know this other than me just kind of surmising that maybe when you look at that window, and specifically of Kevin Durant and a Chris Paul, you understand with a rookie head coach, there are going to be rookie mistakes, and not to say that veteran coaches don't make mistakes. We've seen it time and time again, but my guess is that was maybe one of the final separating factors between KY and Frank Vogel.
When you look at what Frank Vogel was able to do with the Lakers, too, obviously leading them to a championship a few years ago, and that was a team that was kind of similarly constructed to the Suns that had LeBron and AD, the Suns with KD and Booker. Do you see those kind of similarities? And can Suns fans maybe look to that Lakers team to get a feel for maybe how the Suns team may be playing this fall?
Yeah, look, I don't think it's any secret when you're talking about, coaching a team with a Kevin Durant and Devin Booker on it, and Chris Paul as well. There's something to be said about having experience of managing stars and superstars, because that is part of that coaching hat that you have to wear. You think back to Phil Jackson and him talking about winning those championships, and yes, X's and O's are part of it, but the psychology of it becomes in many ways an even bigger factor than than in game and between game adjustments. Those are important, but learning how to deal with these guys, because the reality is, when you're talking about the kind of money and dollars that they command, and attention they command, you have to operate in kind of a different headspace than you do if you're dealing with a young team. So I think that's probably a factor as well. And to your point, yeah, looking at Frank Vogel and how he dealt with Los Angeles, and look, I think back to Monty Williams, the former Suns coach, who was at the time on the short list for the Lakers. The Lakers made a run at Monty before they hired Frank Vogel. And, Monty basically kind of said, like, he didn't want any part of dealing with that, and that being LA, that market and all that. So it speaks volumes, I think, for Frank Vogel, who is a guy who's just a wonderful personality. I got to know him having covered him in the playoffs a few years ago when I was doing stuff for Turner Sports. Just a very low key, down to earth guy in many ways, like a Monty Williams. Understands that it is a player's game, so he doesn't try to make the game about himself, and I think that also becomes one of those attractive elements when you're looking for a head coach.
You kind of mentioned the difference between the LA market and that pressure cooker compared to Phoenix, but obviously there's going to be a lot of pressure on Frank now taking this job with moving on from Monty, this team being so close the last couple of years. I guess, I mean, it may sound silly, but like, how much pressure is Frank will he be under to deliver here in the next 1 to 2 years when this window is kind of closing?
Yeah, well, look, he understands it perfectly well, and it's the same kind of pressure cooker that he walked into in Los Angeles, and that pressure is much more because, and not, not suggesting that the Suns won't be front and center in terms of, media coverage and everything, but you just have to be realistic, the size of the Phoenix market versus the size of the Los Angeles market, and LeBron James, and Anthony Davis. So him having been able to kind of walk through that minefield, because every day for him really was a minefield, especially those first, that first year. So, having that experience, I think, will definitely serve him well with the climate that he's coming into here with the Suns organization.
You mentioned Chris Paul a few questions ago. Now that kind of the first domino of the offseason has fallen, so to speak, what do you think this hire means for the futures potentially of a DeAndre Ayton and a Chris Paul, two guys that have been kind of rumored that their futures may be in doubt here?
Yeah, I'll start with Chris first. And I know that it's been very difficult for Suns fans to, separate what Chris has brought to this team, this organization in his time, and those last, these last few years in the playoffs where his body unfortunately has failed him. But there's few people around the league, certainly few players around the league, who know as much about the game as Chris Paul does. And I know if I'm a Frank Vogel, I'd certainly love to have that guy in my locker room and in my huddle, because he becomes an extension of you as the coach. We don't know what kind of offensive system Frank Vogel will bring in. And I know there's already been some speculation, could Kevin Young find himself staying on this staff? That's up for Frank and the Suns to determine. And, obviously Kevin Young as well. He may have additional opportunities that present and become maybe more attractive for him. That remains to be seen. But I still think that Chris can bring a lot to this team. For DeAndre, that becomes the $1 million question, or the $30 million question, if you will, as we look ahead, because I don't think it's any secret that there was suggestions and feelings that maybe there was a disconnect between Monty and DA. There was probably some truth to it. How much, how magnified it was, I can't tell you. I know when I operated around them both on a day-to-day basis, there was mutual respect and admiration. Did it affect his overall play? It's hard to say, but can and will a different voice and a different vision, maybe light that fire that we all know, can be lit at times with DeAndre. And look, those are the conversations that I'm sure were part of the interview process with Frank Vogel, and frankly, all the candidates, and the Suns brass, James Jones, Matt Ishbia, Josh Bartelstein, that whole collection of decision makers who have to determine, can a fresh set of eyes, can a fresh voice change the productivity level that we're getting from a max player?
You mentioned the decision makers in this process. Just the way the league kind of operates nowadays, would it be naive to assume that Devin Booker and Kevin Durant were at least consulted or had some say maybe in how this all played out?
Yeah, when you're talking about two players who, these aren't second and third year potentially great players. They're both great players. I mean, Kevin Durant's already a first ballot Hall of Famer. Devin Booker is quickly ascending to that same kind of status. And look, you've tied up a lot of money in these players. So yeah, to your point, we would be naive to believe that Matt Ishbia and James Jones went about their business without, throwing out the names of, Frank Vogel and just getting their feedback, their thoughts on could we make this work? I think they understand that at the end of the day, they're not going to decide who the coach is, but I think they can go a long way in saying, I'm not sure that particular guy is a fit for who we are and what we are as a collective.
So last thing for me, just looking forward to the rest of the offseason now. Obviously, we assume there will be some movement on the roster. Difficult with the cap and everything like that. But how different do you still anticipate perhaps this Suns team on the floor to look when this season eventually tips off in a few 4 or 5 months from now?
Yeah, look, I think it's safe to say it will look very different, if for no other reason, when you consider the number of players who were on one-year deals this past season. So those players, may have more attractive offers. They might see better opportunities. So I think it's safe to say that there will be at least 4 to 6 new faces on this team. And again, going back to now that you've got a new head coach, what does his system look like? What we know this about Frank Vogel, that every place he has been, defense has been paramount and it's been a top priority, which is fantastic. I look at this Denver team that's in the NBA Finals now, and people got caught up in the Suns sweeping them a few years ago. Well, a couple of things happened. They got healthy. They made some very shrewd moves the last couple of off seasons. But Mike Malone said it before the season started, like, if we want to get where we need to be, we have to be a better defensive team. We've seen the Suns be that at times, but I guarantee you that will be one of the top 2 points of emphasis for Frank Vogel, because his teams have always relied heavily on being an impact and difference maker on the defensive end. So you look at that, then you start looking at personnel who might fit that mold.